On July 9, 1916, the Deutschland, one of the German Navy's new submarines, surfaced in the harbor in Baltimore, Maryland. Subs like the Deutschland had already proved themselves to be some of the deadliest weapons of the war raging in Europe. Now, alarmed Baltimore residents wanted to know why Germany had sent one of these powerful and stealthy ships to America, a neutral nation. The captain of the Deutschland reassured them that his ship was built to carry freight, not to fight, and had come on a peaceful mission. He was lying, but there was no way for Americans to know. Espionage, which could have given U.S. officials the inside intelligence they needed about the Deutschland's real mission, was a primitive, part-time pursuit. Its ability to gather useful information limited at best.
Before the First World War, spying was a very basic venture, and during the First World War, it sort of came into its own.
What you're seeing in a way with intelligence during the First World War is how modern intelligence is born.
Over the next few years, a new breed of spy would learn how to gather the kind of intelligence their countries needed to protect themselves in both war and peace. With hard work, daring, and the latest technology, they would change the course of World War I and the history of espionage.
They suddenly realized that they had in their hands an opportunity to read the enemy's messages, which means reading the enemy's mind.
Two years after the outbreak of World War I in Europe, America was still at peace, still officially neutral. But the Germans thought America wasn't neutral enough and hoped espionage would help them to end America's unspoken role in the war.
To understand what the Germans wanted to achieve in the United States with regard to espionage during the First World War, it's very important to keep in mind what the political situation was between 1914 and 1917. Germany was at war essentially with Great Britain, France, and Russia. The United States was neutral until 1917. At the same time, many US manufacturers supplied the Allies with arms, and the Germans couldn't trade with the Americans, at least not to a large extent.
Most American manufacturers would have been happy to trade with the Germans too, but Britain, determined to keep American weapons out of its enemies' hands, had imposed a complete naval blockade.
Every ship that sailed from the United States going to Europe had to pass this blockade. These ships were searched, and if the destination was Germany, and if the Brits found anything on this ship that could be remotely used for war purposes, the ship would be intercepted, the cargo would be expropriated, and the ship would be sent back.
The Germans couldn't break Britain's blockade, so they decided to stop the flow of arms to the Allies at its source: America's foundries, factories, munitions depots, trains, and ships. Their weapons would be sabotage and secrecy.
The Germans had to walk a thin line. Obviously, if the Americans knew that the Germans had sabotage teams operating in America, they would have been pretty angry, and it would have accelerated American entry into the war. What they did is they tried to blow up these factories, disrupt these munition supplies, but tried to make it look like an accident.
They brought a chemist into the United States somehow and set up a laboratory in a Washington suburb where he manufactured these little incendiary devices in the shape of a pencil. And when you snap the pencil in half, it would flare up and could ignite other combustible materials. So one of the things that the Germans did was plant these little devices, and then a number of ships were set afire at dockside, and others had timing devices on them, and they would go off while the ships were at sea.
But most of the German plots failed.
The degree of incompetence among German intelligence personnel in the United States in the First World War is really quite extraordinary. Several of them managed to lose briefcases containing highly incriminating material in American public transport. There's no control over what is happening at all.
This commercial attaché dozed off on the subway, and when he woke up, he saw that it was his stop. So he jumped out of the train and rushed off and left his briefcase behind. The men who were watching him quickly grabbed the briefcase and they got off the train too. Then they leaked the material to a newspaper and it became a big scandal. The attaché was thereafter known as the Minister Without Portfolio.
The papers in the briefcase revealed the existence of a German spy network in America and led to the deportation of the absent-minded minister and a number of his Confederates. But reinforcements were already on the way, and Germany hoped its new submarine, the Deutschland, would allow them to slip into the country, past the few men assigned to protect America from spies.
The United States was neutral and was really not prepared for, this sort of espionage and sabotage effort. There were hardly any federal agencies that could take care of that.
When the Deutschland arrived in Baltimore Harbor on July 9, 1916, the spies and saboteurs it carried were able to simply walk away from the docks unchallenged and to disappear into America's teeming immigrant communities. The Germans were about to deliver a shocking lesson in the value of both espionage and counter-espionage, a lesson that people living around New York Harbor would never forget. It came during the early hours of July 30th, 1916, just 3 weeks after the Deutschland's arrival in U.S. waters.
It was 2:08 in the morning, and it just came out of the blue. This terrible explosion. It wasn't just one explosion either. It was like a 4th of July fireworks with all these armaments going off one after the other. The whole sky was lit up, and people didn't know what was going on.
Panicked New Yorkers thought downtown Manhattan was going up in flames. But the explosions were actually coming from farther away, just behind the Statue of Liberty in a corner of New Jersey known as Black Tom.
Black Tom was essentially a peninsula in New York Harbor used as a storage facility. In the summer of 1916, there was huge amounts of ammunition stored at Black Tom, and the Germans knew this ammunition was destined for Russia, specifically for a Russian offensive against the German forces. So the Germans wanted to do everything to make sure that this ammunition would never reach Russia.
Now the ammo destined for the Russian front, over 2 million pounds of it, was sending residents of New York and New Jersey running for cover instead.
It was really remarkable. Manhattan was peppered with debris from this explosion. Windows shattered. The blast could be heard as far away as Philadelphia. The Brooklyn Bridge buckled.
By dawn, every bit of the ammo at Black Tom had been destroyed. No one in the U.S. knew it yet, but the Germans had pulled off the most effective act of sabotage since the beginning of the war.
If you look at film footage of Black Tom the morning after, it really looks like Apocalypse Now.
Not even the Statue of Liberty had been spared. Shrapnel from Black Tom punched hundreds of holes in her copper skin. As news reports revealed the full extent of the damage, New Yorkers began to wonder how and why it had happened. Was it an accident? Or an act of sabotage linked to the war raging in Europe? And could it have been prevented? Finding the answers would take decades and help lead eventually to the establishment of the FBI. But in that summer of 1916, America wasn't the only nation being forced to develop more effective forms of intelligence and counterintelligence. On the battlefields of Europe, the generals running World War I faced an age-old problem: how to know what their enemies were planning to do next. This kind of information couldn't be gained by monitoring the front lines. It required penetrating deep into rear areas, where troop movements could be observed and recorded before the enemy battalions made it to the front.
The rear areas of the German front against the British in the First World War are all based in Belgium. German rear area movements occur on rail lines, and the only source the Allies have on these movements are Belgian civilians.
Soon after the Kaiser's army marched into their country, a group of Belgian patriots began organizing a spy network to gather intelligence on German troop movements. They called their group La Dame Blanche, the White Lady, in honor of a mythical figure who was supposed to protect the Belgians from German aggression. Their work would prove the value of one of the most basic forms of espionage, human intelligence, information gathered by men and women using nothing more than their eyes and ears.
What La Dame Blanche is doing is actually monitoring all German movements on the only kind of transportation the Germans can use, the railway net, which means that you are actually able to say the Germans are not moving trains, unusually, in central Belgium, and that means that generally speaking nothing has changed. Or you can say there is a massive concentration of German train movements and we can plausibly identify the movement of several divisions.
Before long, the patriots in La Dame Blanche were operating train watching posts across occupied Belgium and on into northern France. Because the trains ran 24 hours a day, entire families often took turns keeping an eye on nearby rail lines. The passage of each train was carefully recorded, including the number and types of cars, and whether the trains carried troops, weapons, or general supplies. It was dangerous work.
From a German point of view, any civilian who involves himself or herself in military activities is automatically liable to be shot.
Some of these operations became known, and the Germans clamped down on them hard. At times, civilians were executed for these things, rightly or wrongly, because they were said to be involved.
There's no defense. As far as German military law is concerned, you are dead on the water.
But once their information was in Allied hands, the risks taken by the men and women in La Dame Blanche paid off.
The British and the French and Americans are all highly impressed by La Dame Blanche. All military officers and intelligence personnel speak of it in the highest terms.
By 1916, Allied generals knew they could rely on La Dame Blanche to keep them up to date on the deployment of the German troops on the other side of the line. Again and again, their reports allowed the Allies to meet Germany's offensives with their own counteroffensives. By the last 18 months of the war, La Dame Blanche was providing 75% of the intelligence from behind German lines. For the generals fighting World War I, it was convincing proof of the value of human intelligence. But the war would also prove the value of more sophisticated methods.
Spying, just like warfare, was revolutionized during the First World War, to a large extent because of technology.
The great change in spying came with the invention of radio and the development of code breaking. This produced an enormous increase in two things: the volume of intelligence and the value of intelligence. The volume because an awful lot of messages are radioed, and in value because you are getting the very words of the enemy, the very orders that the enemy is giving, and so you can't beat that in getting intelligence about what's going to happen.
They had to find ways to conceal the message, and that's where coding, encoding, and decoding comes into play.
There are two kinds of methods of putting messages into secret form. One's called a cipher, one's called a code. A cipher is where you exchange letter by letter. So CAT might become, in the simplest form, DBU. It goes letter by letter. On the other hand, there are codes. Codes go word by word, and they are contained in books. So if you want to change a coded message, it's like translating it from an English language dictionary into French.
Without these books, codes are almost impossible to crack. But Britain's code breakers had a head start, thanks to a surprise gift from their Russian allies.
The British were very lucky at the start of World War I when the Russians captured a code book from a stranded German cruiser, the Magdeburg, and This was, in a sense, a Rosetta Stone for the Britons to begin their code-breaking activities in World War I.
The information in the Magdeburg book helped the British keep the German Navy's surface vessels bottled up for much of the war. But the Germans were changing their codes and creating new ones all the time. To keep up, the British needed more code books. A natural place to look for them was in the German U-boats and other ships sunk by the Royal Navy. The job of going down to find them went to a young seaman named E.C. Miller.
I cannot imagine going into the hull of a submarine with these corpses hanging around and with conger eels eating at the corpses and bouncing up against you while you're trying to figure out where these code books are located in some kind of a locker somewhere and coming out and doing them. But he was a guy with cold blood, I guess, and he managed to do it and did it not once, but many times. When Britain got these code books, they suddenly realized that they had in their hands an opportunity to read the enemy's messages, which means reading the enemy's mind.
The power of code breaking to reveal the working of an enemy's mind would inspire the creation of a whole new kind of espionage, known as signals intelligence. In 1917, this new discipline would help the British to change America from a neutral non-combatant into a full partner in the war against Germany. It all began that January, when a top-secret message was intercepted by British agents working in London's Admiralty building in a nondescript office called Room 40.
Room 40, the British naval code-breaking agency, has been attacking a lot of German diplomatic codes with some success. And one morning, Nigel de Grey, who's a middle-level figure in the political department of Room 40, comes to Admiral Hall, who's in charge of British naval intelligence, and says, "Sir, would you like to bring the United States into the war on our side?" And Admiral Hall looks at him and says, "Well, yes, my boy, I would."
De Grey handed Hall a copy of a secret document history remembers as the Zimmermann telegram. It was only partially decoded, but it was already diplomatic dynamite. In it, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann seemed to be revealing a plot to take the death and destruction of World War I to a whole new level. The Germans were about to declare unrestricted submarine warfare on every ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean.
It meant that the Germans would sink any ship, regardless of whether it was an armed merchant ship, whether it was a warship, it was an unarmed merchant ship, whatever, in waters around Great Britain in the northern Atlantic. The goal was to strangle Great Britain, to intercept trade between the United Kingdom and the rest of the world, primarily the United States.
If the code breakers were right about Germany's plans, Zimmermann's telegram might force America into the war. But until the telegram was completely decoded, the British couldn't be sure.
Hall is convinced that it's hard to play this unless you've got a perfect reading, and so he sends this back to the political department and says, getting a perfect reading of this is your highest priority.
Zimmermann had done all he could to keep his plot secret. He sent his telegram by cable instead of the radio waves that his enemies could easily intercept, and had its contents hidden behind a code he considered unbreakable. The agents in Room 40 knew that the future of the war, and possibly their nation, might rest on proving him wrong.
No other significant intelligence coup has ever had the importance of this, and I think you can say that in those few moments when they were breaking the code breakers held history in the palm of their hand.
The British made little headway until they realized that Zimmermann's message was actually a code within a code. That breakthrough allowed them to go on to discover a plot even more shocking than the declaration of submarine warfare.
The Germans, by deciding to launch unrestricted submarine warfare, have taken a path which they know will bring the Americans into war. The only question being when. And they are trying to stave it off as long as they can.
The rest of Zimmermann's telegram revealed a plot to keep America out of World War I by getting it entangled in a war in Mexico, a nation the US had invaded twice in the past 2 years.
Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign secretary, drafted this alliance proposal to Mexico and telling the Mexican president, look, there's probably going to be war between the United States and Germany, and in case this happens, we offer you a pact, we offer you an alliance. You attack the United States, you get money and weapons, arms from us. In turn, you will receive Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. This was territory that they had lost in the War of 1848.
This turned out to be such a fabulous propaganda possibility that the British, in the form of Admiral Hall, gave it to his foreign minister, who gave it then to the American ambassador, who gave it to President Wilson. And when Wilson realized what this was, he made it public, and suddenly there appeared on front-page headlines all over the United States on the 1st of March, 1917, statements that the Germans wanted to make war with Mexico against the United States.
It's pretty sneaky, to put it mildly. And from the perspective of most Americans, this is absolutely outrageous. I mean, I think it would be very hard for anyone not to regard what the Germans are doing as outrageous in lots of ways.
German sympathizers in America even insisted that the telegram was too outrageous to be true. It had to be a British forgery. But Arthur Zimmermann himself proved them wrong. When a reporter asked him if he had sent the telegram, the surprised foreign minister simply answered, yes.
The whole country exploded, and 6 weeks after this, the United States entered the war.
Zimmermann's plot had backfired completely, thanks to signals intelligence. Espionage would never be the same.
It alerted admirals and generals and politicians to the significance of intelligence, and it alerted them to the importance of code breaking.
Everyone learns that intelligence is an important way to gather power in war, especially code breaking, but also human intelligence. And they find out that if you're going to gather intelligence effectively, it helps to have professionals.
And countries that had not had any code-breaking agencies before World War I, such as Great Britain, the United States, Italy, and Germany, those countries did not have code-breaking agencies before World War I, all set them up afterwards.
Over the course of the 20th century, these secretive agencies, and the spies who ran them, would complete the transformation of espionage from an amateur activity to a full-time profession. Governments have come to rely on spies for protection from terrorists, other spies, and attacks by enemy nations. Secrecy keeps their activities out of sight until a rogue agent is caught using espionage for treasonous or greedy ends, or when their efforts to protect us fail. But as spy tools grow more and more sophisticated, one thing is certain: espionage is here to stay.